15th Revolutionary Strategy live stream. We have a fairly full panel here today. We have got the main man himself all the way from Iran via Philadelphia or something like that. Puya, how's it going?
Hey, Tom, how are you? It's Detroit.
Detroit.
Yes.
Did you say this was number 16? And
it's 17. Is it 16?
Oh, we always talk about where I'm from in the beginning.
Yeah.
We'll get it Sunday, Puya.
Yeah. It's all good.
Now, next we have Lexi. Lexi, how's it going?
Oh, hello there. Doing all right. Visiting a friend in the city, so just chilling in a nice air-conditioned apartment in the Upper West Side.
I used to live in the Upper West Side. Whereabouts?
Oh, no shit. Let's see. We're on like 103.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I used to live on West 75th Street and Riverside.
No, oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to live on the Lower West Side, a couple real estate markets ago. Wow.
Is this in New York?
New York.
So good. So good they named it twice.
That's right.
Yeah. And finally we've got Kyle from General Intellect Unit all the way from somewhere in Canada. Canada is a very big country, so let's just say Canada. How's it going, Kyle?
I mean, who could say, right? Like, it's just indeterminate. Yeah. I'm here. I'm ready.
Are you? Let's narrow it down here a bit. Are you living in tundra or non-tundra?
Non-tundra. I am in a place that is similar to tundra, but not quite tundra.
Is it the steppe?
It's a lot like the steppe, actually. Yeah, it's the prairies. Yeah.
All right. A man of taste. See? No tundra. See, Tom?
Well, Kyle, I have a question for you then. Around where you live, are there many tundra cats?
No, not at all. No, there's no big cats around here. They're we used to have like a lot of mountain lions in my hometown, but not here.
I was trying to make a very bad joke about the cartoon.
Oh, I see.
I was asking. Okay. I thought you were just making a dad joke, and then Kyle took it seriously. I'm like, a real thing.
No. He reversed. He did the reverse sarcasm on me. God damn it. Yeah, God damn it. Okay.
God, I'm lost in a maze of irony. Help.
Yeah. Help. It's you're down some mine shaft. Very irony. Right. Now, here we are. Today, we're in chapter 8. We had a bit of a break for the last few weeks because we were all doing random different things, going on holidays and such like. So we're back and we're in chapter 8, which is on political consciousness. And we're going to get into this part here where he talks about the importance of symbolic unity. So he was talking earlier about how I think it's the Second International was an international of symbols. And let's see why he thinks this thing is so important. Lexi, how do you feel like a bit of a read?
I like a bit of a read.
Okay.
I'm a read. Okay. So let's just get these first couple paragraphs. The importance of symbolic unity. The Second International offered mainly symbolic unity of the international workers' movement. But this symbolic unity was profoundly important to the development of workers' parties in individual countries. This point is clearest at the fringes. In Britain and the United States, May Day became, in the 1890s, the focus of the early stages of development of class political consciousness after the later 19th century slough of pure trade unionism. Thank you. 19th century slough of pure trade unionism. And in the early 20th century, the connection to the Second International pushed the more advanced trade unionists towards politics and the socialist groups towards unity. Similarly, relations to the international movement pushed French, Italian, and Russian socialist groups towards unity in a single party, actively encouraged by the Kautskian leadership. And the single party then advanced class political consciousness at a level that the divided socialists could not. there are no doubt other examples. In fact, the same is true in Germany itself. In 1875, Liebknecht wrote a Lassallean program for Gotha, perhaps imagining that this was necessary to achieve unity. In reality, the Lassallean General Association of German Workers was desperate for unity and would have accepted it on any terms. It had been losing ground to the, quote, Marxist Eisenachers because of its hostility to broad trade unions, its dictatorial internal regime, and the Eisenachers' clear opposition to the imperial state, which had been expressed by their MPs' refusal to vote for war credits in 1870. The Eisenachers' roughly democratic character, support for trade unions, and internationalism were all legacies of the First International.
Okay, so what do people make of this? He's trying to make the case that because the International took and focused on kind of symbols of unity, that it was particularly important. Is that a reasonable argument?
I think it undersells what's going on underneath the symbolic unity, but I've been making the case throughout this book that McNair is, in a way, maybe presenting something that's cut off from the causes, and I'm inclined to read him charitably as not just saying that, the symbolic thing is the most important. Geez, if all we need to do is establish some symbolic unity and we can get back here. But the emphasis on this is a little, I don't know. I'm not sure what to say about that. I have more feelings about the way that he draws out the legacy from the First International to the Second International, which we can get to in a bit. But let's sound off on symbolic unity first.
Okay.
I think later in the chapter he says, like, the Second International is symbolic unity because it was still nationalist in character. Like,
right.
Because it depended on growing national parties instead of an international one. Like
I think there's like some historical evidence he points to show that like the actual like secretarial activities of the Second International were somewhat limited to be like, oh, that's why it's symbolic unity, because they weren't actually doing a lot of administration internationally.
That's fair. I guess there was an underlying social process that was rather similar in each of these countries, even though it had a national orientation, and even though the Second International didn't take as much administrative tasks as the First or the Third Internationals, is I guess what I mean. Is that, but yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, I guess I would be interested to know more about like outside of the secretarial activities of the International, what the sort of nation to nation, party to party relationships were at that time. Because those were probably quite significant as well.
Yeah, I was wondering what he meant by symbolic unity instead of like just regular unity. And I think that's what he means, like that the national parties were still kind of like dispersed, or they weren't,
Yeah, because I think he's talking about the International in a very like different sense to the way he was talking about party earlier, right? Like with a party, it was kind of like this loose sort of thing. It's like it's not necessarily highly institutionalized, but I think in this case he's talking about the actual institution of the Second International, and not the broader sort of quote unquote party that formed at that time. At least that's kind of my read based on the fact that like he's pointing to kind of like secretarial activities as like a major part of what does or does not make it symbolic.
There's a line here I just want to read again, because this one I just realized I'd written some notes in my hand copy about it. Let me just read it again. It had been losing ground. This is talking about the Lasallians in Germany in the 1870s.
Yes.
Who were, and he says here, the Lasallians were the ones that were kind of the right wing of social democracy or Marxism or socialism, whatever you want to say it. It had been losing ground to the Marxist Eisenkerners because of its hostility to broad trade unions, its dictatorial internal regime, and the Eisenkerners' clear opposition to the imperial state, which had been expressed by their MPs' refusal to vote for war credits in 1870. Like, that's just been slipped in there. There's very little actually talked about that. That is a major goddamn point in this book.
It's enormous.
It's an enormous point that in 1870 they got the war credits right, and in 1914 they didn't.
Right.
And so all the way through the book, it seems to me there is a case being made that like they couldn't have voted against war credits in 1914 for some like the reason is that the right made it impossible.
Yeah, they blocked with the right. No, that's what changed between 1870 and 1914. They're like, all right, the right, let's hang out. Right?
Yeah.
And so
like
once they merged, there's no way around it.
This is what Liebknecht was doing at the time, according to McNair.
But like, that's people are making it's making the point that because it happened then, it had to have happened. And like, I just don't buy that. You
don't buy that if they block with the right, then that has to happen, more or less.
I don't buy that. I don't buy that. Like, say for example, like it is possible for large parties, for example, the Labour Party in Britain in the 60s to not go to war in Vietnam. Okay, it is possible. Like, and it's possible. Like, I just think that is, people read into these things like these are iron laws. I don't think they are. If they're able to do it in 1870, and like, I don't think it was impossible for them to do it in 1914.
But in 1870, the state didn't have a say within their party, and when you have a nationalist loyalist right, the state has a say in your party. And once the state gets a say in your party, that's an institution that's lasting, hundreds of years. They're going to out-organize you. It's going to happen. Like, you need to have your own agency apart from the state.
But why in the 1960s did the British Labour Party not go in with America in Vietnam? And they did in so many of them. How is it possible that they didn't that time and they did in other ones?
Because it was plausibly not in the interests of the British state.
But it's plausibly not in the interest of the British state, way more plausibly, probably, to not go into Iraq in 2004, 2003. So,
but you're making this a little too general. We're just talking about the right having, like, the nationalists having a block within the Socialist Party. Inside of a revolutionary, communist, group. If you invite in the state, they're going to have a veto power over internal decision making, and this is a token of a type. It's not necessarily that every war is going to go through. Does that make sense?
I know what you're saying, but I disagree. That's my kind of basic point.
Cool.
Like that. I think that there is pressure, definitely, if you get the right in. But just like there is pressure on the moment with Jeremy Corbyn from the right to ditch certain policies. But like, look what happens. Imagine here's an alternative universe, one that I don't think is impossible, one that I think that's reasonably likely. Maybe it's not as likely as what happened. The left of the party or the center do not do credits like they did in the 1870s. They've got institutional memory of that and what it meant, and the right splits for them from a point of weakness, and that they maintain their strength. To me, that's a very plausible outcome, much like it is in like, if you see what's happening with, say, Jeremy Corbyn here in Britain, how the right are always putting these ultimatums, and he doesn't back down, and they're left in disarray. Some of them splinter, and the right are weak. It's just not. To me, it's not an iron law that what happened in 1870 could not have happened in 1914. And if anything, what does it teach? It should be teaching, like, political strategists of the left, that these war decisions are incredibly important, and if you give the right the whip hand, or whatever we want to say it, that will haunt the party. Like, look at the recent.
Can I revise the, can I before you, can I revise the
one
claim,
second,
because I think I can help.
1 second. Yeah, 1 second. Just let me say one very short thing. Look at the debates, the U.S. presidential debates, the Democratic ones. To this day, it's 15, 16 years since the Iraq War, and it's one of the major issues. Like, these war votes. This should be like a core tenet of political strategy. Never vote for a war unless somebody's invading you. It's just simple as that. And it splits parties. It's essentially split the Labour Party. There's no way Jeremy Corbyn could have got into power if the Iraq War couldn't have happened. No way.
Fine, but in the law, it's not an iron law in that in every token instance that the right will necessarily outflank you. But as an iterated process within capitalism, there is a strong tendency, that you will not invite the state into your house and then, keep control in the long run. It won't happen.
What is this is just something I'm curious about, but what is the Labour's current position on NATO? Because, like, that seems like a similar sort of problem, right?
Correct. Corbyn has backed down on some stuff with respect to, like, what his personal points are not what the party's points are.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, like, their party, the position on their on Trident, renewing the nuclear submarines, they pretty much capitulated there. But like, right. But the thing is that, like, it's not like Corbyn is at the position of strength that the SPD were.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, the left and the SPD were a dominant part of that party. Not, I don't know, dominant, but a major part. Where, like, so, like, the room for someone like Corbyn, I'm not trying to make the case that Jesus Corbyn's brilliant. I'm just making the case that, I just think that I just do not think the 1914 vote was inevitable. And I think what people can learn from it is that, like, you have to, like, it's just a core learning. Don't vote for wars.
Sure. I think that a complicating factor to the 1914 vote was that a plausible case could be made that this was a effort of national defense, of self-defense. That was an argument that was made, and there was, like, textual evidence brought in from, I think, like, Engels to say, like, okay, this is something that is, like, coherent with a Marxist program, because of the way that the war started, right? And so that, I think, made it more difficult to split with the right. Not to say it was impossible, but it did complicate the matter even more. Although, you could, like, certainly the start of the Franco-Prussian War was also rather complicated. So, like, the fact that the Eisenachers, like, voted against that was, like, really impressive.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's a bit frustrating because this is something I sort of agree with the overall, like, Leninist thrust on, and I don't necessarily end up, I guess, taking it where I gather McNair does, but But if you do take this on, if you do think that inviting the state into your camp creates just a long-term strategic problem that you have to split to overcome, it has grave implications. This is what leads people to either become left-wing communists, abstentionists, to just wash their hands altogether, or to attempt some kind of splitting the difference. And this is really where a lot of the crank stuff is. Like, I guess you could be a crank Democrat or something. But honestly, all Democrats are crank Democrats now. You know, like the center right is about it. It's the center left, which was always like the, you know, super rational, blah 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 blah, is, you know, drawing circles on chalkboards and stuff. So that's all kind of gone. Like the like, well, but I think you know what I'm saying here.
I think everybody in this conversation so far would agree that this kind of war decision is something that would require a split, right? Like, I don't think we're in disagreement about that. Like, it would split the party.
Okay.
I think Tom made that point.
Sorry if that came out wrong.
Yeah, no, I think, like, what I'm trying to say is, like, it's about, we've discussed this earlier, and this is, like, I keep harping on it, so maybe this is my kind of critique of this book, is that you know, you're better off letting the other people split than you split. And if you're voting no for a war makes the right split from you, remember, like, if you look at the Labour Party today, say, in just looking at the dynamics of how these splits go on, it's not like all the right split. They didn't, right? No more than all the left split from the SPD when they voted for it. Some split it. But, like, you know, and so, like, say for Jeremy Corbyn right now, some of the right will split, but most of the right stays in and they shut their mouth. And I think that's what will happen. That's what would have, say, theoretically, whatever, happened in 1914, that many rightists would have split, but the vast majority would have stayed in and shut their mouth. And, you know, I think that if we're literally talking about ever having a party that's of any fucking meaningfulness, that it could ever lead to, like what we're talking about in this book, a majority, we have to have a strategy that can deal with these issues. Yeah, and you have to be fully prepared and aware of it, because it's okay saying we should
the
split
incentive structures of the society.
Yeah, but, like, just because, like, you know, there's always pressures. It's like playing playing Texas Hold'em. Position matters. If you're out of position, you're at a disadvantage all the time, and you're going to realize less equity in the hand. It's just a mathematical law. And similarly, if we're dealing with trying to get a large party from a left radical point of view, you're going to be at disadvantages at certain, you know, the structural disadvantages that you can't do about. But you've got to have your counter strategy. You've got to understand what the disadvantage is and understand the strategies to minimize those things. That's just the way I'm looking at it. I'm not trying to be like...
No, I have common ground here, because there is a structuralist Marxist thing to do, which is to roll your eyes at anybody entering into these structures and then making the right calls. Because once the incentives are in place, betrayal, schmitrayal, there's no such thing. It's just, you know, one billiard ball hitting another. There's nothing you can do about it, which political agency requires not thinking like that.
Right. Yeah.
How did the Russian Revolution ever get off the ground, if that was correct?
Well,
you know, it couldn't.
Right, but the question is, how far does... Well, the Russian Revolution predates a lot of capitalist, like especially highly developed capitalist parliamentary dynamics, which was part of what the left-wing communists would harp on Lenin about, being like, dude, you have no idea what you're talking about. Like, it's so different here. Like, you don't get it. Like, Lenin's like, why is everyone so obsessed with sex there and stuff? They're just reading magazines and shit. He didn't understand what it was like to be in, like, late capitalism, you know, or even 1910s German capitalism. It's a qualitatively different situation. Not all the incentive structures had been capitalist and there for, you know, a century or something. I don't know. The point is that once those incentive structures are in place, there are certain kinds of actions that are, you know, traitorous, but are to basically be expected, to the point where you can't have your moral outrage go off anymore because it's a waste of energy. And so so where we agree is that I don't accept that we live in a totally structurally determined place, and we have to like really delimit how far that goes. Does that make sense? Like,
yeah, but like what I'm trying to, I suppose, you know, I'm not trying to be a dirty idealist, you know, I'm saying the vote could have been different, but I do think like there is agency in these things. And I do think while you're at disadvantage, and while this is every time a war vote would come up, it would put large stress to any kind of a revolutionary communist socialist party, that the learning would be always not to shift there and like the shift to the right in these situations. And the thing is, like, it's like you have to educate your own members and educate them before a war ever happens about the dangers of it. It's like we've got historical, like every war nearly apart from World War II has caused like massive splits in the left in all the different countries that they've happened, the major ones, you know, 1914, 1870, these ones, they had the propensity to do massive splits. So it's like, I think that, you know, the Iraq war, the Vietnam war, just take your pick. It's just repetitive again. Every time war is the one that really causes shit to hit the fan. And it's just something that, I don't know, we should, I don't know, it just stuck out to me that this one line where they say, oh, they didn't vote for it then. And then the whole book is saying, oh, yeah, but everybody must vote for it. And I know the right wasn't in the party to the same extent. But it doesn't...
That's the causal kind of thing that he's saying. That's what he agrees with Lenin on. He's a neo-Kautskyist, whatever. Like, he ultimately doesn't think that the like any variant of a general strike strategy or a left strategy or a, quote, sub-Bakuninist strategy works. But he does think that, you know, the historic center made this error and that Lenin was right about this.
Well, I think Lenin was right that they made an error, but I don't think splitting has been a success. That the error in strategy has been not to prepare your party for times of war and what is the way you should deal with it. And that's the error, as opposed to the vote is the error. It's that when you want to build your party to a large size, you've got to be fully aware that war is the one thing that will destroy it. To me, that's like, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. Anyway, somebody else say something. I'll shut up now.
I mean, I think it might be worthwhile to sort of just like clarify what McNair is saying, right? Is that so I think at the base in this book, he's saying that the working class desires unity for practical reasons, right? Like, it's just a simple fact that numbers are what gives working class politics strength, right? That we don't have the resources, we don't have the money, but we can get together, and if we're unified, we can be powerful. And that desire for working class unity, based on good strategic reasons, also leads to party unity, right? There's a drive towards party unity. And I think what McNair is saying is that, like, when you block with the right, that drive for unity is always going to push in favor of the right. And I think that's maybe a point that, like, we disagree on, because, like, you know, Tom, you're making the point there that, like, well, you know, look at the situation of Corbyn. In that case, there was a split, but you had people on the right who remained in the party on the principle of unity, and were actually, like, strategically disadvantaged. So that is distinct from the sort of scenario that McNair is presenting of, well, when you come down to these sorts of decisions, the left is going to fold in order to maintain party unity. They will stick with a right leadership, given all of the incentives that exist.
Yeah, correct. That's precisely my point. Like, my point is that it's very, like a kind of an initial kind of condition to it is you need to have the left of your party somehow come to power. Like, Corbyn fluked into power, utterly fluked it. Nobody could believe it, but he got into power. And, so the difficulty for, say, somewhere like in America will be to get a left into the dominant control of, say, the Democrats. That's a whole other fucking barrel of fish.
I mean, that's the perspective that's my barrel of fish. That's the barrel of fish I live in, Tom. And from our perspective, that is really, wow, that's a real long shot. That seems crazier than communist revolution. Like,
yeah, but look, Corbyn, like, Lexi, you can't, I don't mean it pejoratively, but like, you can't, okay, you can't imagine how unlikely fucking Corbyn becoming the Labour Party leader was. Like, he was my local MP. The guy would turn up to meetings late with a plastic bag full of bits of rubbish. Like, it's just. I've been at a meeting, and he turns up like half an hour late with a plastic bag with loads of like sheets of paper in it, and he's wearing like a duffel jacket, and like, and he's just, all over the place. Not even a good speaker. You just couldn't imagine it. It's just it blows my mind when I think about it.
Yeah.
So sometimes weird stuff happens, right? But like,
no, for sure.
So like my is that, like, if we wanted to look at which party in history in a major kind of developed capitalist country was the kind of party that could have done something good, and to me it's the SPD, from what I know. Okay, and they were the closest to doing anything that would have been what we would have thought would be what communism or socialism that we want would look like. Now, as like radicals, we should be thinking like, how do we get back into that type of party, and how do we get to a party like that? Now, like, I'm not saying the Labour Party is like the SPD now, but like, I'm just always, when I'm reading this book, I'm always just thinking strategy. If I'm a chess player or a poker player, what is my strategy to get to that position? Okay, so like, for me, it's like, it seems like this is a strategy, and people can like take it or leave it. I'm not saying it's correct. It's something that just kind of has come up to me again and again reading this book. You try and get control of a left party, and then you try and radicalize people with it, and you try and use your base, like in the Labour Party, the membership is driving the party to the left, okay, while the MPs are trying to drive it to the right, and you want to try and constantly make your policies more and more radical all the time, and like, maybe over like 5 election cycles, you wouldn't, maybe your party is actually getting to a fucking SPD party. That to me is like a plan that somebody could put together. Like, I know, like, it's failed numerous times, and now I'm sounding like I'm Novara fucking media, and it makes my head melt. But like, god damn it, like, the Corbyn thing is quite interesting. I don't know, like, the vast likelihood of it is it'll fall flat in its face like Syriza. Don't get me wrong, but
all right,
yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what I'm talking about.
Well, it's worth a shot. It's worth a shot, even though it's against a historical tendency. Is what you're saying.
Well, I don't know. Like,
you said that the membership is generally left while the leadership is right.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I'm thinking about like the DSA, and their membership isn't really that left. Like, if you want to like relative to a leadership, I don't think. And so if you like When you said that, I was thinking like, is Tom talking about like going into the DSA and like making that a left party?
Well, the DSA is way to the left of the Democratic leadership part, the leadership.
Yeah,
That's
Yeah,
my
I mean
point.
like,
My point is not that the DSA are actual commies. My point is that they are to the left of the leadership. And my point is in Labour Party, they're to the left of, well, they're probably not to the left of Jeremy Corbyn, but they're to the left of the party leadership, you know, like the MPs and all that
Parliamentary
stuff.
Labour Party.
Yes, they're way to the left of them. And like the point is that can you have a kind of a ratchet, is there some possibility for a ratchet strategy where you have like a feedback loop which makes the membership ratchet more left with, you know, just
the point that really like comes up to me here is that kind of like anti-politics point, the observation about this the state of current party composition. That in the case of Corbyn, you do have like this activist membership that has pushed the party to the left because the right has no actual mass basis. Like they just are administrators of the state, and they have a very tenuous relationship to the population at large. And I doubt that was actually the case with the SPD. Like I think that like all of the factions in the party had more of a significant membership backing and more of a significant mass basis than what you see in the contemporary Labour Party, which is quite detached from society and is open to this kind of push. Because the you know the right in the PLP is really a paper tiger as far as having any kind of mass basis that they could actually bring to bear.
Yeah. Yeah, that is what goes on in my head when I think about this. And the anti-politics stuff even makes me question what relationship the things that people call like the left right now has to, you know, emancipatory Marxian communist politics or whatever. And there is a way that people are getting more and more left wing, but, you know, not necessarily really. And people might use the word communist. They might use the word Marxist. They might use the word socialist. But there's a, you know, a continued substantive drift away from, I don't know. I don't even know how to say it without sounding really hackneyed or silly. But, you know, like
Obama.
Democratic populist values, you know, not small d democracy, you know, like people actually having some sense that, I don't know, human beings are capable of decision making. There's an anti-humanist drift where it just goes, I don't know, there's something deeply reactionary about it.
about which say about saying that people,
the kind of political actors you get out of a situation of sort of mass disenfranchisement and disassociation with politics. Like there's a real control freak, kind of vitriolic sort of déclassé tendency in the existing kind of radicals on the left and right, and in the political class generally, that is kind of like inherently anti-emancipatory. So there's something anti-democratic and anti-proletarian about it. That seems it's just something I'm deeply frustrated with, and I don't really know how to get around it. It's just something that complicates it for me when I'm trying to adopt, you know, a worldview that, I mean, Tom, it sounds like if I could adopt that worldview, I could, you know, kind of integrate into reality and society more, maybe society more than reality. But like, and it sounds attractive. I kind of want to believe it, you know. I'm telling you why I can't. there's something that really seems different about mass politics now, that makes me skeptical towards even, you know, just my desire to like want to go out and like and do something in general. Like there's something, there's a true nausea about it. It affects a lot of reasonable people. Why?
But like, I don't know. Like people, I think, I don't know. It's like people are people, and I think people have always been like. There's always been a hell of a lot of like disingenuous, scummy people you'd have to deal with in politics. I don't know how much it's worse or different than ever. I would say it's much of a muchness. It's my instinct on it. You know, I just think like, you know, obviously DSA and all these will be full of shitty politics as well. But like the shitty politics that's around now is a lot better than it was 10 years ago. You know, I just think people are, you know, it's like an awakening of, you know, socialism is like, it's starting to fucking move again. The dynamic is moving.
It's probably true. I mean, things were pretty nutty. I don't know. They're different kinds of nutty. They're different kinds of good and different kinds of bad. It is phenomenally weird to say.
So, for example, you don't have as many people who sat. Like, I think if you went back 10 years ago on the internet, a lot of people who would be socialists today would have been libertarians 10 years ago.
For sure.
Definitely.
Now,
Derek, maybe
Derek,
me.
Right. But Derek will grant this and then sort of point out, is this a hopeful phenomenon, or does this tell us something about the sort of level of engagement that we're getting? And I don't know. Maybe it is like a hopeful phenomenon. I tend to read it as a hopeful phenomenon. You know what I mean? I tend to read it. I tend to read it that way.
Yeah, I think even though there's like this incredible disconnect between this shift in thinking and organizational forms.
Correct. Yeah, big time.
And like, I feel like the state and society really are quite at odds with each other at this moment. Right. And like, yes. It's not clear to me that the shift towards socialism implies some kind of resolution of that dilemma. I do think that the change in thinking should be read positively. Like, I don't know where it goes, but it's, you know, I lived through the 90s. It was bad. It was really bad, you know?
Yeah, it seems very far away. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I know that things are I feel that things are better. And I mean, things are certainly better on, like, you know, a gender front or whatever since in the 90s. But like, in terms of these like fundamental strategic issues, you know, yeah, I mean, there has been like a change in discourse. There are like people, I mean, it's not from planet Mars to be a socialist in the US. And that's a banal point.
What do you mean by socialist though? What do you mean, like a communist, or like Bernie Sanders?
Whatever.
Like all of that was kind of like Cold War delimited in the 90s. Like there was like the hangover of the Cold War. You were a traitor in the 80s and the 70s, or you were getting laid in the 70s if you were a commie. If you're in the 80s, you're a traitor, and then in the 90s, you're just like, you just don't belong.
You're the guy on Seinfeld. You're the guy on the Seinfeld episode about communism.
Yeah, you're literally a joke. Like the Tropico computer game series. They have all these like shitty, like, you know, it was kind of racist but they had all these like shitty stereotypes and dumb jokes. They have a communist in it, and the joke is that they're a communist. There's no like additional like winks really. They just say communist stuff, and that's the joke.
Yeah. That was the mood.
Though. That's funny. And like, it is true. Like imagine, right? It's 2008, right? YouTube's just been launched, and we're doing a McNair reading group series for a podcast. How many people would listen to that goddamn thing? Seriously.
Wait,
yeah, that's about when the book was written, right?
It was. So it's not even no time travel involved. YouTube existed. But if I did it, it would instead of getting like the 100 views it does on YouTube, it would get one. You know what I mean? You know. And even in a podcast, like there was no left-wing podcast in 2008. There was probably 100 libertarians. Now I'd say the socialist or whatever you want to call it, whatever people, to me, it's just the term they call it themselves. Even to call themselves socialism is a massive movement in America, not so much in Europe, but in America. And it's like, I'm sure it's got to be 3-1 socialism to libertarian podcast now, as opposed to 100-1 the other way. It's just got to be.
Yeah, libertarianism is not like very. I don't encounter it that much in my everyday life. I don't know about you people.
Not like I used to. Like, it used to be like the degree to which the Fraser Institute was successful in propagandizing in British Columbia, where I grew up. This was a American libertarian funded propaganda organ that's existed forever, and they produce like school book materials, and like they get a bunch of stuff on the news, and just basically exist to drive politics in a libertarian direction. That stuff was really pervasive when I was growing up, and it feels like it's a little like it's still on the news, but it's not popular in the way it was, because it's just it's just not the zeitgeist, right? Like, libertarianism, I feel like, is a bit on the wane.
Yeah. I would really like to see some I would really like to see the left that's developing right now, like, really, they just haven't. The thing for me is they're just not like as they don't have that push towards like nationalizations and expropriations, that I would like. And internationalism. Internationalism is not even. I had no idea what internationalism was before. It's not a part of the discourse right now at all.
No, socialist politics is so nationalistic still.
Yeah,
but this is like these are long movements. They're not short movements, and I think we'll see it coming. Corbyn is talking about nationalizing rail and energy. Renationalizing the post office, the railways, and energy. So if he wins, they're nationalized. That's so it is starting. And they're not going into like the old form of nationalization. They're going to be some democratic control over it. So, I mean, like, as in non-politicians' democratic control. So it's interesting. We'll see what happens. God damn it. It'll go the way of Syriza and it'll fall on its ass. But something is moving. That's the way that's the way I feel about it, Look, we've done one page. We haven't even done one page. Yeah, that's what I was about to.
It's been 50 minutes.
But wow, I need a cigarette. That was a great conversation about this page.
Okay, should I read?
Are you implying that you've actually come, Lexi, during that discussion? Is that what you're implying?
I'm just saying, I feel very satisfied. I feel closer to everybody. I can't. Are people
not too
watching?
close.
I can't figure out. But seriously, is there a link that we can send people to? Sorry to do this on air, but
it is. What do you mean? It's streaming on YouTube.
Oh, okay, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Okay. If you go to my YouTube channel, I can't open it twice. It says not to open up YouTube.
Got it. No problem.
But we're getting the YouTube on the right hand side. You should see the YouTube comments are coming through. So we've had a few from Paul Hansel, Data Lore, etc. Okay. Do you want to hit this paragraph then, Puya?
Yes. The working class is an international class. It can only attain full political consciousness of its character as a class. Become a class for itself if this class is expressed in international unity of a workers' class movement. The symbolic unity offered by the Second International was less than was needed for the proletariat to take power, but still necessary for the proletariat to get as far as it got in the run-up to 1914. We can see the same phenomenon in the fate of communist and Trotskyist parties / groups after the dissolution of the Comintern. The allegiance of the tankies to the USSR and its leadership was deformed and bastardized internationalism. But it was a form of internationalism nonetheless. The Eurocommunists, as they lost their internationalism, also lost their ability to promote any sort of class politics and became, if anything, more liberal than the Social Democrats.
Like that.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah,
That is true.
that's very true.
But I
I've-
mean,
I've-
like, is it the internationalism that's, you know what I mean? Like, you could say that, like, internationalism and class politics and everything, you know, they disappeared simultaneously. So how do you know that internationalism, the loss of international, like,
No. So this is a good point, and let me give it an uncharitable rephrasing. Okay, that you know, it doesn't really matter to your nation state. Actually, I'm going to be paraphrasing McNair, so it's not uncharitable. It's something he says elsewhere. It doesn't matter to the nation state if you're betraying them on behalf of the international working class or on behalf of one of their adversarial nation states. They just, you know, you behave like an antagonistic actor. So essentially, you know, anti-revisionists often did this. They often behaved as an antagonistic actor within their state in a way that social democrats, but especially not Euro-communists, did not. And this was even true to some extent to some revisionist, you know, quote, Khrushchevite, quote, communism before Euro-communism.
Yeah, I think there's that trajectory that McNair paints of like basically going to socialism in one country and then kind of directing the official communist parties abroad to just sort of pursue a national politics and not make waves. And that drifts progressively more and more towards Euro-communism, right? That because there is no international horizon, revolution seems the terms of revolution begin to drift. I think it's kind of the argument he's making there.
But I feel like if he's kind of, like, if you're just looking at things like empirically, like, I forgot what the word was when like many things are correlated with each other, and it's like, okay, so, you know, like, what's causing what?
I know what you're saying. Yeah, you're saying, Puya, that it's like the fall of the Soviet Union caused Euro-communism, or was it the fall of the International that caused it?
Yeah,
You know,
you could just pick out any of these factors and say that, you know what I mean? And this was
yeah,
what
but
causing.
but I think that it's a kind of a dialectical thing where all of it is so interlinked. I think they're all multi-causal. But like I think, look, I wrote some notes here at the bottom, and I was trying to figure out when I'm reading a book, sometimes I write notes, and then I come back to it, I don't understand, and I finally understood what I was talking about here in this note there a minute ago. It's to do with like what we were talking about before about how the right always has this pressure on the party to push to a left party to push to the right, to the center or whatever. But it seems to me that if you have an actual functioning international, you could have a counter pressure on the left parties that are part of that international to push them to the left.
Mm-hmm.
What do people like? Is that not a counter acting force that we can use to counter that other thing?
I don't see how you have a national communist politics and you end up anywhere other than the right position, right? Like,
correct.
If your orientation is national, how do you not end up repeating LaSalle in some way?
Yeah, I don't think that's incorrect, but I'm saying like his like causal arguments, you know,
it's not as simple. Yeah, it's not as simple as he's saying here. I think that's definitely true.
Like
that's true for the whole book.
Yeah, I don't think his causal arguments are very good. I think it would be better if he argued like, you know, internationalism is a correct position because X, Y, and Z or whatever. You know, like, you know, you need an international economy to be able to produce goods efficiently, and you know, whatever reasons he gives you. But like his like his like causal arguments I don't think are correct usually. But they don't like ruin the book.
Well, I've been kind of engaging with this recently because, you know, he's kind of influenced by the analytical Marxists and has a lot of stylistic similarities, but like, disagrees with the nominal analytical Marxists. He's polemicized, against them recently even. And I think the word you're thinking of before is overdetermination, when there's many causal factors. And am I right about that?
No, that's
No.
that's a word from Althusser.
Well,
right?
there's a kind of standard Anglo philosophy of science definition, and then there's Althusser's spin on it.
I think it's like
yeah.
I'm thinking about like the statistical word. Let me look it up.
Oh, okay.
I think
so. There's something more formal that you're thinking of.
Yeah, but it's like multi-correlarity or something. I don't know.
Oh, okay. Got it.
Yeah.
What is it, Tom?
No, far ahead. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. That's cool. Well, regardless,
I'll look it up and then.
It's a general philosophy of science point. I think that there are multiple causes to these things, but there's, a lot of Marxists have tried to just kind of not try to do causal analysis on these things and be correlative, and they kind of end up saying nothing because
I think overdetermination. Yeah, multiple correlation. But I think like overdetermination is a different concept, because overdetermination is saying like all these things like mutually determine each other. But I'm saying like,
okay, yeah,
like if you're trying to like, yeah. But I'm saying like he's looking at this like empirically. He's like saying, yeah, this like empirically happened, and then that empirically, or like these things empirically happened, right? And he's like, but you can't like, you can't just like look at data and like, it's not, and just like come to your conclusions.
Right. It's a provisional hypothesis, if not, and your research should actually proceed assuming it's not true to try to disprove it to see its power.
But like, okay, so like these things are like all correlated. You know what I mean? All these things are like correlated together. So like, it's really hard to parse out what's doing what if all these things are happening together. And if you're looking at if you're looking at a data and like a million different variables are correlated with each other, like
yeah, this is a challenge of social scientific explanation, or any I mean really a lot of kinds of scientific explanation. Like,
I suppose what he's saying here though as well is that he's putting forward the international, a causal reason for why when you get rid of what the power of an international is, and when you take it away, what would it end up happening. So I suppose he's making an argument that this correlation is the one that matters. That's kind of what he's saying.
Yeah. What's
he says
the word?
He's imputing causal power to it, but I don't know if he's wrong. Like, I think like
what's he doing? I think is it called induction? Is he using induction right now?
Well, induction isn't necessarily like
no. Induction
bad.
is he's using like, well, I don't know if you'd say it as induction, because
well, it's not a deductive proof. He is making like a claim that it was this factor that changed, this counterweight or something.
Anyway, let's not get too stuck up in it, will we? We kind of understand what we're saying.
Okay.
But I don't think this. I actually don't have a problem with a lot of his causal mechanisms are only, in my opinion, wrong by the omission of the social layer. There's a whole like broader kind of demographic, kind of like a labor movement thing going on underneath that needs to be kind of discussed in more detail to get a better causal explanation. But I don't have a problem with him looking for causal explanations in this.
Like, do you know what it reminds me of, Puya? If you ever like listen to like a geneticist talking about mutations or evolution, and they'll say something like and the anteater evolved a big nose so that it could stick its nose into stuff.
They'll say something super theological.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a functional explanation.
But when they say it, they don't mean that that's what happened. They said, oh, I need to get a new nose. But it's a shorthand for talking about the randomness, and it's done all the time in science. You know what I mean? Where they'll actually, if somebody, where like they'll say it in the kind of incorrect way because it's a shorthand to describe the right way. And I think that's how I read most of these things here as well.
It's like when Malthus created his argument, right? He was like looking of the population and the I forgot what the theory is actually called, but it's the one where the population grows faster than food. But
yeah,
like he was looking at data and he was like, oh look, like the population's like increasing and and then like the what is it, like the food production and the population were like, he was looking at this data and they were like, it was doing what he was saying up like while he was alive, and then like soon after,
yeah, arguably those trends only held before capitalism.
Yeah, it's extrapolating, a thing into the future. Look, can we go on? We've only done a page and a half, and we're getting stuck into methodology here. I'm not trying to, but I do think the big point for me, like in this paragraph here, is that like the international can work as a counter to that force from the right. Do people think that's a true thing, Kyle?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that you're saying earlier that the right tries to pull the left to the center, but I don't think that's really quite true. Like, I think it's more the case that like the right pulls the center to the right, and they don't really care about the left very much. Because the left isn't going to block with them, right? So it's So I think what the international can do is kind of create some sort of like provisional relationships between the center and the left, and it can help the center from actually just collapsing into the right, which is what happened like almost universally. Like there's very little kind of like parliamentary left politics that are not right in the world today.
Right. Yeah, and I just want to add that, this is that what he was giving there isn't a functional explanation. It's an agency-based explanation. There's nothing to compel one to go right without an There's nothing to compel one to go left without the international.
Yeah, it's super important. Even if like it's only symbolic, it matters that there is some kind of symbolic unity that people actually care about, right? Like you can have like, all these Trotskyist internationals, it doesn't mean anything. But if there is this kind of like common symbolic project, it means something, right? It's like, I remember even, like I remember during Occupy, you had these like little tiny demonstrations of international working class unity. Right? Like very small things, like people in Egypt, like during the Arab Spring, buying food for protesters out in Wisconsin, right? And like just seeing any kind of meaningful international working class unity was like kind of shocking because it's so off the horizon, and that and the degree to which like we are just trapped in the discourse of the right is really, really strong. Like, yes, there has been a move towards socialist politics lately, but it is very much within the realm of right socialist politics. Yeah,
and the symbol of unity in the Second International, the sort of, I don't know, classical workerist identity politic, is in a way like highly preferable to the Soviet Union litmus test that became the symbolic focus of the Third International and the sort of politics that came out of it.
Yeah, because for obvious reasons, that was a turnoff to many, many, many workers.
Yeah, and maybe I shouldn't be weighing in on which one was better or worse, but they're both kinds of, I don't know, symbolic politics that don't work today, but they both point to the importance of symbolic unity and what it meant for those symbols to fall apart, it is hard to deal with in materialist terms, but I think it's true.
Mm-hmm.
All right, here's what I'll do, right? Send me your addresses there in the chat, and I'll send you all a pizza. How about that?
I'm so inspired.
International.
I'm so inspired.
Let's get-
I'm voting against war credits.
Woohoo! There we go. Just push it to the right. Push it to the left, motherfuckers. Sorry. Yeah. Pizzas.
I mean,
pizzas
but
are the way forward.
seriously though, it is nice to have this international conversation about left politics, right? Like we've got Americans, you know, we've got Canadians, we've got people, we got people for like we even have people in the chat, right? Like it's nice to have because this thing doesn't happen very much.
Yeah, think of all the people in New York City that I'm not talking to, including Brooklyn, right now.
Man, you should be out there selling, giving out flyers, looking for that Patreon book out in Brooklyn right now. Giving out Swampside flyers.
I should be hustling at the Verso Loft.
Signing autographs, giving out posters, you name it.
Yeah.
That's what you should be doing.
Yeah.
Damn it.
You want to buy my mixtape?
Well, here. Yeah. So like this
you guys gotta buy my mixtape.
Hell yeah. I'll buy your mixtape. Oh yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, we gotta move on.
Do you accept pizza? Okay, let's move on.
Yeah. Puya's mixtape is like this is a refrigerator, and this track here, this is a air conditioning unit, and this one over here, this track is a blender mixed in with a fridge and a microwave.
Puya is trying to keep you on task, and you're mocking his creativity.
Sorry, it's getting late here. Okay. Let me read this one little sentence. I think it just kind of sums it up. Even in distorted forms, then, the struggle for international unity of the working class and the struggle for working class political independence stand and fall together. And I do go with that. I think that is true. Whether we'll have the statistical evidence for Puya and we won't know. We'll only find out. Puya, we'll only have the evidence after 100,000 failed revolutions, and we can get the stats ready for you.
I think it's like a it's like a question. It's a question of theory, kind of, because it's not really. I don't know how you would go about like. You need like a good theory to be able to explain this stuff.
Yeah.
Right.
I just want to like underline how controversial this statement is, right? Like to us, it's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But like, if I brought this to my local NDP branch, or like there isn't even a branch of the NDP because they don't give a shit about, having any like real membership. But like, if I brought this to my local NDP MLA and I was like, okay, this has to be the foundation for our socialist politics, I would get laughed out of the room. Like this is a really, really controversial point. It's not widely accepted at all. So it is worth talking about.
Yep. I agree with you by falling silent for once. But
Sorry. Yeah, I agree too. Sorry, but I was muted. Okay. Now we're going to get on to this most honestly, it's something that the left never talks about, Russia. So let's go there.
Yeah.
We don't have enough Russia.
Russia's a country it's in Europe and Asia. Okay? I don't want to give too much background. Let's just go in there.
There's bound to be a good joke, like along the lines of, do you know the one about like what's the biggest city in the world? Do you know this joke?
Not sure.
Dublin, because its population keeps Dublin and Dublin.
Oh,
it's like there's got to be a similar crap joke about Russia. Yeah, I think there's like some inner rush. There's some rush joke that we could splice in there.
In which city? Which city do the trains run fastest in the world?
Moscow, because they're Russian. There you go.
Boom!
Also made it a little fascist too. The double boom.
Oh yeah. Probably true. Probably did.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who's reading?
I'm reading this one. Oh no, Kyle will read it. Kyle hasn't read it today.
Kyle's got
Come
to
on
read.
now.
Sure. The Russian question. If the policy of the Second International was fundamentally one of separate national revolutions, there was an undercurrent that suggested a repeat of 1848. This was expressed in Marx and Engels' responses to the Russian Narodnya Volya and became current among Russian Marxists, most explicitly in Trotsky's Results and Prospects, but also in Lenin's Two Tactics. The idea was that the fall of the Tsarist regime would rapidly trigger a European-wide workers' revolution and an 1848 on a higher level. This was the view held by Marx and Engels at the time of the Crimean War, and the correspondence with the Narodniks and Russian prefaces to the manifesto revived it. It was, in fact, a reasonable but mistaken response to the defeat of 1848. Russian intervention had played an important part in 1848 in defeats in Poland and Hungary, and the Tsarist regime was one of the principal guarantors of the European regime of the Congress of Vienna and the Holy Alliance that backed it. Knocking Russia out of the picture should therefore let loose the national democratic movements in Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, etc., and this would bring down the Austro-Hungarian and German regimes and trigger European-wide revolutionary aspirations in the style of 1848. It was a mistake because 1815 was fundamentally a British-sponsored settlement, placing a pressure lid on continental politics for the benefit of Britain. True, the Tsar, the King of Prussia, and the Emperor of Austria had provided most of the soldiers to defeat France, but the money that funded their armies had been raised and mobilized through London at the behest of the British government. The 1847 economic crisis led to the British-imposed lid being blown off all across Europe in a revolutionary explosion. The primary change that ensued, the regime of Louis Napoleon in France, freed French capital from the British-imposed chains of 1815 so that the French state could begin to compete on the military international level with Britain. As a result, in the ensuing period, Germany and Italy were driven towards unification in order to emulate France, and governments began to use or return to using war imperialism as a means to bleed off the internal contradictions of domestic politics and economics. Hence, after the Crimean War, the idea that the Tsarist regime in any strong sense guaranteed European political stability or was the policeman of Europe was illusory. In 1914 to 18, the point was emphatically demonstrated. Far from the Russian Revolution triggering the European Revolution, the European War triggered the Russian Revolution. The Central European national movements then proved to be a bulwark, first of German, then of Entente policy against the Russian Revolution. The Russian Revolution did at one remove trigger revolutionary movements in Hungary, Germany, and Italy. It did so not by the route envisioned by Marx and Engels, that the removal of fear of Russian intervention in Central Europe would open the way to a revolutionary movement which would spill westwards. Nor did it do so by the route projected by Trotsky in Results and Prospects, that the Russian Revolution would spill over into Germany and or trigger a collapse of the London and Paris financial markets. Rather, the perception of the revolution as a workers' revolution triggered an international radicalization of the workers' movement. This radicalization reached its highest points in the countries which could not see themselves as victors in the war: Germany, Austria-Hungary, and, in a slightly different way, Italy. Advanced workers in these countries saw a possibility of workers' revolution as a result of 1917. They could see this possibility because of the prior symbolic international unity of the workers' movement in the form of the pre-war Second International. Should I continue on and finish this?
I think we've got quite a bit there. We can take a pause there.
Okay.
Got my
That is
hand
like-
over my heart.
like when I interviewed McNair about this stuff, these few paragraphs here were very kind of hitting to me, because this would lead us to think that the gambit of Lenin and the Bolsheviks in doing their revolution was a huge strategic misstep.
Yes.
And it seemed to me that he's saying a double thing here. He's saying that Marx and Engels were wrong, and he's also he's saying when Marx and Engels thought that would have led to revolution in 1848, they were wrong. And he's saying that not only that, because they had their causality wrong, that really it was a problem with the British not financing stuff which caused that triggered those revolutions, not the Russians. So he's saying that not only did Marx and Engels go wrong, but Lenin then even applied it incorrectly, because the Marx and Engels thought at the time that the Tsar was being paid by England or whatever to keep the Eastern Front under heel or whatever. But like in 1917 or whatever, that the British I'm losing my brain. My brain is falling apart. Somebody fix what I'm trying to say.
I gotcha. This is pretty related to what Puya was saying before about the difficulty of establishing causality. Critical theorists have a saying they like. It's the owl of Minerva flies at midnight. It's that like you kind of can't really like you don't necessarily like see the important causal factors unless it's in retrospect. And you're dealing with a situation where not just, Trotsky and Lenin and not just Marx and Engels, but really the entire revolutionary tradition from 1848 forward kind of had this view of Russia as the gendarme of Europe. And that there's always a temptation to, I'm not going to say do induction, because you got to do some induction. You have to do some analogies to the past, but to kind of overgeneralize, over-induce, like principles from the last experience as being like iron laws of your current experience. And that's definitely what was at work from 1848.
I think it's kind of like the positive legacy of 1848 was the realization of the importance of the social question and the importance of an international workers' movement. McNair acknowledges that the creation of the international and that sort of symbolic international workers' unity was a meaningful contributor to attempts at revolution at this time. The sort of negative side of it was that revolutionaries took the wrong lessons about the actual state of play of politics in Europe, apart from the sort of political versus social question problem, which obviously, was a major thing that sabotaged 1848 and also was learned from, right? Like, people took kind of the right lesson from that, but the wrong lesson from what happened in terms of international power politics.
Yeah, and McNair laying it out like this there's some people that are going to read this and like not get up for a couple days, just be like, whoa, I'm only familiar with the primary sources. I'm only familiar with what, the big beards had to say about these things. And even if you read around the revolutionary tradition more and you're a primary source type, you're not going to find that many counter arguments to this. This is just a different history than they expected and that they thought they were living in. The actors, necessarily have incomplete information. But yeah, that's what people were working with. It is tremendously sobering how wrong they got it, even considering the fact that, we are talking about people that did act in ways, of course, that ended up that they couldn't possibly imagine.
Yeah.
But they did act. And so you don't have to have like a perfect grasp of history in order to act.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like, this kind of comes out of that sort of like world system stuff, right? Like I think that's where this kind of argument is coming from. Yeah, and just obviously that didn't exist at the time. And also I think for me, it's like, I usually look at Marx's biography and his like time spent as basically like a anti-Russian crank in the popular press, right? Like he's like one of the people who would be doing like the anti-Russia stuff today.
OG Russiagate.
Yeah, OG Russiagate was definitely Marx's job. And I usually just kind of look at that and sort of like laugh, and I'm like, oh well, everybody's got their stuff, right? But like when you think about the degree of vitriol and hatred Marx had towards the Tsarist regime, and the way that actually kind of filtered down at the strategic level, it did actually have some harmful effects in meaningful ways, and not just this kind of like random crankery, like the sort of unpleasant side of Marx's biography, right? Like that like. This is the stuff that like he was really off base in a lot of the stuff he said about Russia.
I mean, it's partially rooted in anti-Slavic racism.
Yeah. Well, and just also 1848, right? Like like there were real experiences of the sort of hopes and dreams of liberals and socialists being crushed at that time that leave some really deep scars. A lot deeper than Hillary Clinton not getting elected, like it's it
was the Russians.
Yeah.
Kyle, watch your mouth. Watch your mouth.
I'm sorry.
I'm joking.
Please don't take me onto MSNBC. I'm sorry.
I don't know. You just laid out how we make $1 million right now.
Yeah, right. That's
Marx
how we get
hated Russia.
That's how we get our next textbook published. Is we get our funding from anti-Russian crankery, just like Daddy Marx did. Oh boy.
Oh,
seriously, you may be joking, but there's probably actually good money in that. What we should do is
I'm going to bring back Cold War Marxism. Yeah.
What I'm going to have to do to you, Kyle, is I'm going to have to go like, what was it, Clockwork Orange on you, sit you down in front of Rachel Maddow and repeat for 12 hours.
No.
With your eyes, strap you down, keep your eyes open.
Tom, I
Yeah.
can't allow this to continue.
Okay, why don't I read this next bit? Because I really like this chapter. Do you know what I read? Oh, what I say here, I'll say it after I read it. Okay. At first, October 1917 seemed to show that the working class could take power. This image promoted revolutionary attempts elsewhere, but the impulse rapidly ebbed. As disturbing news began to filter west, even Luxembourg in prison was hesitant. As the character of the Soviet regime was rendered more explicit in the theses of the 1920 and 21 Comintern Congresses, the ban on factions and the Kronstadt events, the majority of the existing militant left activists of the workers' movement in Western Europe took their distance from the Bolsheviks. This was reflected in the 1921 splits from the Comintern of both the larger part of those amongst the left of the Kautsky Center who had flirted with it and the left communists, larger than they had later become. These splits foreshadowed the future. The nature of the Soviet regime was to become a primary obstacle to any attempt of the working class to take power in its own hands in Western Europe, and ultimately to international class politics, to international class political consciousness more generally. The image of an international chain of national revolutions starting with Russia was, nonetheless, to be the governing idea of Comintern international strategy, and after it, that of the Trotskyists. Well, God damn it! Like there's a couple of paragraphs there, right? What I really like reading this book is that he lays down, 5 or 6. Well, no, 5 or 6 is probably too many, but 3 or 4 massive strategic errors of Lenin and the Bolsheviks. Just lays them plain. And what I find difficult as somebody who's not ever had drank the Lenin Kool-Aid is that how people can think the guy is such an amazing strategist when nearly every one of his key strategies were goddamn awful. Let me point some of them out. One of them was, changing the vote on the Brest-Litovsk treaty. So he went against what the actual vote should have been. That's supposed to be one that McNair says happened, right? Then you've got the idea that the Russian Revolution would spark off other revolutions. Wrong. Then you have Lenin was in power when the Comintern came up with their 21 or whatever they are theses, which absolutely would split the parties all across Europe and weakened and put all these communist parties into sect mode for 100 years. Like, to me, they're just amazingly bad strategic choices, and I do not understand why people think Lenin was this head, this genius. I just find it baffling.
It's all tied up with what he's saying here, right? That like the nature of the Soviet regime was to become a primary political obstacle to any attempt of the working class to take power into its own hands in Western Europe, and ultimately to international class political consciousness more generally. And I think like the reason why people get so obsessed with Lenin is that he became a symbol of that international class political consciousness. And that was hugely destructive. But for the people who cling to Leninism, I think is very important, right?
Yeah, I know it's kind of, I don't know. I just find it baffling.
Yeah,
it's just really
like when I read this, like, okay, I'm coming from like a sort of, I guess, post-Leninist perspective, but when I read this stuff, it's hard to take a post-Leninist perspective. It makes you feel like the whole thing was, like a tremendous error. There's this old like quote by Max Weber, German sociologist. He was in like the SPD, big revisionist. I mean, I don't even know if that's the right term. Anyway, he says he's absolutely convinced these experiments in Russia can only have and will have the consequence of discrediting socialism for the next 100 years.
Oof. Oh.
It's right. And I'm going to channel some Chomsky here. I'm going to channel some Chomsky. Chomsky said that the fall of the Soviet Union is the best thing to happen for socialism. And he's probably in the long term feckin' right.
I don't know. I mean, maybe in the long term, but in the short term, it was absolutely. I mean, but you know what? I guess if the Soviet Union was never a success, then its implosion wouldn't have been so traumatic. But it's just so hard to say. A lot of people hear this stuff and just hear, oh, I mean, so just say, why try? Fuck it. Like, and it's no, glory to the October Revolution and all that. But what happened from there? Like, where was the mistake? If October wasn't a mistake, and I'm not inclined to say it was, what's the error? What do you do in that scenario? Could it be that Lenin had a good strategy for staying in power, but a bad strategy for communism? Like,
yeah, definitely. And like, what's the story? Like, is could it ever? It's just a bad goddamn strategy. Full stop. The left was in disarray in Central Europe. How are they all going to have successful revolutions when they're all in complete disarray? Just a bad strategy.
Yeah, and so I try to talk to people that are relatively well. Excuse me. I've been, sometimes people approach me for like advice, like kind of common sense, like Leninists, that are just sort of open and are just sort of taking on the revolutionary tradition. And it's just so hard to tell them that just these casual resonances will just lead you astray. And it's not because you're not trying to be radical. It's really confusing because basically the people before us were incredibly confused and just doubled down on things that have caused us a lot of intellectual scrambling, has caused us a lot of mental damage. and so much of it is the righteousness of the left and the importance of symbolic unity. I mean, they're correct, but like you can't. I don't know. Scientific socialism is supposed to be something else. It can't just be like a religious fetish object that, as like pixie dust. If you believe in it and clap your hands, like it'll work. Like the Soviet Union did have a sway over people as a sort of like imaginative space of non-capitalism in the world. But what it really was in a way counterproductive for the global communist prospect. Like, and I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to look at like the gains that came out of October in the rest of the world, and at the same time acknowledge how destructive the Soviet Union was for the international workers movement. Like it's so hard to hold those two things in your mind at once, because
I mean, they might as well be like a parallel universe. It's so bizarre. But, eventually the Soviet Union exports the brain worms, like it doesn't take that long.
Yeah, well, and this catastrophic falling out that he describes that happens as soon as people as soon as workers start to learn what's actually happening in the USSR is really, really damaging, like just enormously damaging. And then, what do you get later down the line, right? You get like new left stuff, which is very much confused by all of this.
Yeah, it still takes on this sort of like weak chain thing as an extrapolation from the Russian experience and the Chinese experience, which, very different experiences. But they were looking for that causal factor in a way that, is conducive to acting, and makes one pretty dizzy how wrong people got it. But again, these are the actors. These are the people doing shit. There were people that were correct, but they were like throwing tomatoes on the sidelines and no one took them seriously.
Or they just went full on reactionary, right?
Right.
Like
they lost their fucking minds. Or they just, not even lost their minds. They assumed that their convictions were like incompatible with humanity because of how distorted it got.
Or that they could somehow change American power to be something like what they wanted out of socialism, right?
Yeah.
Like there were like deals struck and compromises made that led to sort of like what we got out of Cold War American ideology. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, look.
What do you mean, like New Deal?
Kind of. This is after the new, or like
Great Society.
Great Society is more it. Like post-war American internationalism, right? Like modernism, American modernism.
Like the Marshall Plan and the okay, the UN.
Yeah, the UN. Yeah, like there are a lot of ways in which like socialists sort of made their peace with that, and it did influence the character of what ended up happening in America in the Cold War, but certainly it was a deeply compromised and damaging arrangement in the long run. In a similar way to like, you look at what was positive about the Russian Revolution abroad and how that all ended up kind of going in a bad direction too. It's like, it's so fucked up. The 20th century was a disaster, right? Like it's
one after another.
The Soviet Union internally, it was pretty. It wasn't that like they developed their industry pretty well.
Yeah, it
was a progressive in a lot of ways.
You got right socialism out of the Soviet Union, right? Like it was a distorted kind of right socialism.
It's not socialism the way Marxists talk about it, but it is what people think of as socialism now, and what some people thought of as socialism before. Like, so I guess it's kind of socialism.
No, it's not. People think socialism is Sweden, and they think communism is Russia.
Well,
Right.
you got to go to
Or-
socialism before you go to communism. I mean, I think that whole debate is so fun. It's so fun because all the terms have been emptied of content.
Right.
That like you can just have an entire conversation with people. I think Tom has said this before. You're using all the same words, and they're just floating signifiers. They don't fucking mean to you what they mean to the other person.
Well, here-
yeah,
All of this stuff is why I put all my hope into North Korea. Now,
the Juche ideal will surely get us out of this postmodern malaise.
Here's me.
And Comrade Bernie. Comrade
Yeah.
Bernie and the Juche ideal.
Come on.
Yeah.
Why not? Why not? We threw in our lot behind the Soviet Union and Lenin for so long. What's wrong with Kim Il Jong?
Did I ever tell-
That's not a joke. That's really not a joke. That's the way a lot of people think. That's even to an extent where people are doing like solidarity, and kind of just the urge to displace your political consciousness somewhere that's more important. You know what I mean? Like, it's hard to overstate that.
So, like, I have a couple things to say. The first thing is, like, on North Korea, when I lived in Japan, like, I feel like I was a lot softer on North Korea just because I was scared they were going to shoot missiles at us. Like being that proximity to North Korea is like, well, maybe we can work something out. Maybe it'll get better eventually. Maybe it's not so horrible. There was a lot of sort of like self-deception I did in terms of just like just not wanting a war, and I feel like that's not really an excuse for a lot of people abroad who find ways to convince themselves that North Korea is a great place. But you get a lot of really strange ideologies. Like I don't think I ever talked about this before, but I knew this guy in university who was a Maoist and was convinced that Mao was actually a reincarnation of the Buddha, who was a space alien who had come to Earth to spread enlightenment to everybody. Like, this is the kind of like I do not consider that to be significantly more just like brain rot than the people who are like North Korea is the vanguard of international revolution. Like, those are both just really bizarre perspective.
I could go with that. I could definitely go with Mao Space Alien. I think that's pretty fucking good. Like, you could probably attract a lot of people in California. Go to LA, you could set up a fucking cult there. You could do well on that.
Well, I mean, if you're in California, you really see the pipeline from the new left to the new age. There's so much similarity, and it's devastating. Yeah.
It's a right wing phenomenon.
Once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah,
it's a right wing phenomenon.
Like
new age stuff.
Right, but
new left.
Then you think about the new left like prefigures this, and the new age in a way is like a way of subsuming those like revolutionary political horizons to more revolutionary ontological horizons, and they're both ways of dealing with like alienated senses of agency and power and desires for change, just alienated at different levels. And I mean, at least crystals and incense and like, Mao's a space alien, if you buy their ontology, they have a more plausible causal mechanism there. If you're committed to materialism, like, you can't do that anymore. Like,
well, and I just think about like the number of New Left people I've known, or people who are students of New Left people who were just like super into Heidegger. And like a lot of that happened in the dissident movement in the Eastern Bloc too. Like there was so much of that just like movement to the new age, right? Like what was it, Václav Havel? Like he was a big new age guy.
Right.
Yeah. He also like he didn't. Was it how do you pronounce his name? Václav.
Václav. Václav.
Yeah, Václav. On the day he came over to, I think, the American Senate or the Congress, and they gave him some like medal of freedom, and he gave this big speech, and it was really important. The very day, I think, and he talked about how the US was a beacon for freedom and all this stuff. I think that the exact day the US had like gone into Honduras or Nicaragua and killed like 5,000 people. You know, that's like,
Yep.
I remember Chomsky saying it, like it was literally at the exact day, and he stood up there and do it. So that'll tell you all you need to know about these goddamn anti-communist heroes, communist anti-communists. Now here,
but you know, I feel like this is also of a piece with the thing that McNair was talking about the Euro communists becoming more liberal than the liberals.
Yeah.
Right. It's the same sort of degeneration.
Yeah, like CPUSA wouldn't endorse Bernie because Bernie in 2016 because Bernie wasn't a realistic candidate.
Yeah, and the Blairites came out of that. You know, look what happened to the PCI. Like it's just wild. Like that is another like enormous mind fuck. Like that whole degeneration there.
Yes. Well, let's move it along. We've got 3 or 4 pages done. Let's do our last page before we go off. Lexi, will you read this section, Comintern and the Trotskyites?
I sure will.
Trotskyists. The Trotskyists.
You mispronounced
Trotskyites. That's nearly better.
Trotskyites is almost uniformly said in between Wrecker and between 3 sets of parentheses. So, the idea that became the Communist International began, as we have already seen in Chapter 4, with the anti-war wing of the Second International, and with Lenin and Zinoviev's struggle within this left for an international split. Comintern was able to emerge because of the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917, in October 1917, and the survival of the revolutionary regime into 1919, when the first Congress of Comintern met. The result was that Comintern had a double character. On the one hand, it was an international of the anti-war left, attempting to redeem the honor of socialism after the ignominious political collapse of the Second International. On the other hand, it was a fan club for the Russian Revolution and its leaders. The fan club aspect became more prominent with the defeat of the Hungarian and especially the German and Italian revolutionary movements. On the one hand, the Russians had the prestige of victory and the material resources of state power. On the other, the Germans had lost some of their most eminent leaders, and the Westerners in general had failed where the Russians had succeeded. It was natural for Comintern in these circumstances to become a body that propagated the idea of the Russian Revolution as a universal model. In international strategy, this had 2 aspects. The first was that defense of the Soviet regime was the central touchstone of the Communist Party's internationalism. The idea that it might be appropriate to admit the defeat of a proletarian socialist policy in the face of the defeat of the Western revolutionary movements of 1919 through 20 and of peasant resistance in Russia, and carry out a controlled retreat to capitalism was literally unthinkable to Comintern. Whether such a retreat was a possible option is doubtful, but the inability of the communist parties to think it probably contributed to the fact that the degeneration of the Soviet regime into open tyranny brought the communist parties down with it. It also produced among the Trotskyists a bizarre body of competing theological dogmas about the Stalinist regime that provided ideology for the Trotskyists' endless splits. This is among some of the most devastating paragraphs in the book.
Hit it, Lexi. Hit it.
The idea that it might be appropriate to admit the defeat of a proletarian socialist policy in the face of the defeat of Western revolutionary movements and peasant resistance, and carried out a controlled retreat to capitalism, was literally unthinkable to Comintern. And then he said, well, maybe this was not possible. This is doubtful. but historical materialistly, if that's a word, that's just unquestionably true. Like
true?
Well, in terms of Marx's old theory of historical materialism, right? Kind of got to have the capitalist productive forces for communism to even be on the agenda. And so if you don't have that stuff yet, there's two ways to get them. You overthrow capitalism in a block with more developed capitalist countries, and you can like peacefully, import them at your own pace, or whatever. Like, or you can
piggyback
right.
on their productivity or whatever.
You can piggyback on the capitalist productive forces, the developed capitalist productive forces of other powers. The other option you have, traditionally in socialist theory, like before this really became a thing, was like there was no other option. Like you're fucked and isolated. And Marx and Engels like essentially warned about this and McNair discusses this in other parts of the book when he talks about what would happen to an isolated regime from that point forward. Like, historical materialistly, you're supposed to have that stuff. The actual situation of the Leninists created basically an ideological pressure for a second option. This ended up being expressed in, someone who understood historical materialism fairly well was Nikolai Bukharin. He ended up writing the basis for socialism in one country. And originally, this was sort of like supposed to be, in a way, like a drawdown from the kind of revolutionary intensity that animated the whole Bolshevik project. And Bukharin was no slouch. He was pushing for, if I recall correctly, Bukharin wasn't like initially for the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. He knew damn well that without the rapid expansion of the revolution and the seizure of big capitalist productive forces, the revolution was fucking doomed. He knew full well that. So when he was pursuing this, research avenue, there's a whiff of desperation about, and this ends up being subsumed into a less, in terms of the Comintern, it's less right wing in the sense that they don't want to just draw down into like markets. No, they wanted to pursue a centrist option. And so Stalin capitalizes on this desire to continue the revolution within this country, comrade. We can't admit the defeat of the revolution, but yet we are in one country. That's the basic bounded choice model that leads you to Stalinist cultistry. It's, it's bound up in the isolation without capitalist productive forces. Like, it's hard to explain, not all the political errors that come out of this, because there's some unforced errors, there really are. But like, that's the basic choice model you get.
So if there were Western revolutions, what, like, they couldn't probably plan the economy at this point in time. So why?
Yeah, that's an additional complication that kind of invalidates the whole idea of a proletarian revolution at that point. Like,
yeah, like they probably. So what do you think would have happened? They probably would have done like a NEP type thing, like a more efficient, like a more efficient.
Best case scenario, they avoid World War I and develop cybernetics early. That would be it.
I think in the short term they would have gone towards market socialism.
Yeah,
because
that was a fairly influential ideology at that time.
And honestly, there was some legitimacy to that being the historical materialistly like best way of doing it. There was no like at that time better technology for dealing with a complex economy, like distributionally. Like there just wasn't. That didn't exist yet.
But the economy wasn't that complex. But the economy wasn't that complex in like 1914. They didn't have 1 billion products or 500 million that we have now. Like they probably only had like 10,000 probably core ones that could probably be planned by councils. I don't like, you
But
know,
if there, but if there was
planning
any,
wasn't
but if there was any remaining capitalism in the world, like, you know, that capitalism would have developed, you know, at some point, like, would have entered that like market, like the later stages of capitalism that we know to some degree, where that aspect of consumer choice becomes attractive and becomes a hallmark of freedom. And
yeah, but
probably in our communist bloc, we would have had the same kind of Khrushchevite envy, you know, of capitalist success.
But what I'm trying to say is that, like, perhaps let's say you got an amazing situation. The Russian Revolution, the German Revolution succeeded, and the Russians went with it, and the Italians went, and the Spanish, and the British, and everybody had a revolution, and you had a big, massive European, Eurasian bloc, and they each did like national planning, say, and there was some internationalism with it, and they developed computers, and then by the 50s or 60s, there was no World War II. Obviously, there would be some fucking war. Somebody going to fight them, but you know,
it would have been a class war. We won the class war. Yay!
Yeah, like planning in Russia worked reasonably well up until the 50s or 60s, didn't it?
Well,
yeah, it did.
Well, in like,
some things, yeah.
It had
like,
a higher rate of growth. I mean,
yeah, but like, oh, what a cost.
Yeah, it had an extremely high rate of growth.
Yeah, an extreme and an extremely, yeah, like the human cost was greater than virtually anything else.
I cannot imagine that if the Western Revolution succeed, you get like, you know, Stalinist forced, like, quote unquote primitive socialist accumulation. Right?
It was literally unthinkable to Kautsky that would be the case.
And so I guess I should revise what I said. Like, yes, market socialism was quite influential at the time, but when you think back to it, you know, Otto Neurath was trying to create a non-market planned economy in Bavaria at this time. Mm-hmm. The prestige of the German planned economy during the war was very high. Mm. There certainly were forces that also could have tipped it towards a non-market outcome in Europe as a whole, because yes, you know, it might have even helped that they weren't doing just horrible corvée conscription of people at an enormous human cost, right?
Is McNair's argument that the political forces would be different if there was revolutions in the West, and that's what would lead to a success of the world revolution?
Well,
yeah, this is to a great degree about the reason that the Third International was able to be a Russian fan club. You know, if there were other competing models for success, you know, I mean, they might have made the same fetish.
Multipolar, right?
Yeah, they would have made the same fetish error of doing, oh, these are the right revolutionary policies for your country because these are the only ones that worked before. But it would have been, there would have at least been it would have been like 2 or 3 different fan clubs in the same house.
Yeah, which is like going back to the sort of earlier historical discussion about like class dictatorships. That's kind of like the model that McNair envisions, right? That like you have competing tendencies within the class dictatorship, and like it becomes a class regime, but it does not become one without differing views of what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
okay.
I mean, I just wanted to say, like, we can see like today how the technology we have really like makes non-market planned economies much more viable, but I wouldn't want to write off entirely the possibility that, the entire ingenuity of the Russian, of the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe couldn't have, in a more sort of free and open society, come up with a better solution. It's impossible to say.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
also, political factors are kind of important. And also, you have better access to raw materials in different areas in the world. And so, that increases your efficiency. So that probably would also help. And
you don't get all the
also
German scientists going to the USA, all
and
kinds of
also
things.
That's it. And Ireland has all the potatoes. You boys you better be nice to us. There are no chips for you guys, no fries. If you're not nice to patties.
Yeah.
And also they could probably afford that really high rate of growth, considering that if the means of production in the West are a lot better, you can afford putting more aside for growth if your output is very high, like a more absolute quantity.
Yeah. It's planning did work, reasonably well at high cost, of course, for a bunch of like the essentials, it wasn't until later on, really, like after World War II, that honestly, there was all kinds of terrible things happening inside the USSR, and they were like, because of how concentrated it was, the errors that they made were some of the most catastrophic in history because they're so concentrated. And it's hard to overstate that, and because of the kind of repression that you got. I mean, you would have never had that kind of like famine in a different sort of society. Yes, you would have had famine, but it's a different kind of famine. You get different kinds of famine in communism than you get in other kinds of like class society or Soviet communism.
I don't know about that.
There's
Ireland,
a great stuff.
Ireland was exporting food to Britain during the famine.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah. What Amartya Sen has like a great study. I mean, and I'm maybe doing a heterodox reading of it, but about the
Indian famines, is it?
Yeah, it's fuck me. I'm burning out a little bit. Just cut all this. Cut all my lines. Fuck it.
Will do. Do we have anything more to wrap? I want to wrap up soon. Like, do we have any more do we want to say about this paragraph? We're kind of getting all over the place on planning here.
Yeah, let's wrap up.
Fuck planning. Forget about it. No, okay, so let me just wrap up here. The point is that, like, if there was other revolutions, it would have affected the consciousness of the Third International. It would, like, the Bolsheviks would have had to compete maybe with other tendencies that were corrupt in different ways, maybe in tendencies that were corrupt in the same way. I guess it could have led to the same thing. But it probably, wouldn't be the kind of stuff we're dealing with right now, where people have, like, the single revolutionary vision.
I have a hard time imagining that, like, a Third International that includes people like the Austro-Marxists would have gone the same direction.
Yeah.
Like, there's just really different point of view. And like, you have people like in Europe at that time who had sort of different ideas of how planning might be arranged and were more sort of conscious of like the epistemological and methodological problems that you would run into. That could have made a positive contribution if it hadn't been like, this kind of society where if you're an intelligent, free-thinking person, you're likely going to be shot,
To this day, the culture of the left still bears this impact. And you might say the incentives are there beforehand, but this does provide just a powerful, way of going, a powerful ideology for doing it. I mean, I was kicked out of a like pluralist McNairist project, quote pluralist, like during the recording of this series. I helped start Cosmonaut magazine with Donald Parkinson, right? And it was more or less like acceptable that we had some sort of, there was something that went on. There's clearly some personal elements to it, I don't understand it entirely, so I couldn't communicate. But there, like the political norms were there, where it could be framed as cutting out like a wrecker for disagreement, not for sabotage, but for having a similar framework and disagreeing on some points. That was like pretty acceptable. Most of the people that are participating in that, I mean, they didn't like disassociate from that. They didn't go, "Oh shit, that's wow, that's bad." We got to get out of here. No, it's sort of an accepted part of left political culture. This happened while I was recording this.
Yeah. That's it's heavy.
I designed their website, by the way, and they still have it.
It's a cool website.
Thanks. Yeah, I did it for free.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we'll have a go over to the chat. That's after putting us all into deep depression. Let's see, we have Data Lord, Tara, Paul Hansel, Sophia Dunkelberger. That's a made-up name. That's definitely a made-up name. Stank, which I must admit is my favorite internet name of all time. Stank. JK was asking, actually, I think, about a source for Marx saying something about Lexi, where you were saying they said Marx and Engels talked about don't get isolated, that'll be a disaster. Where is that from?
McNair talks about it in, is it chapter 2 or 3? It's, I think, in the 1850s. He's talking about the possibility of an isolated socialist German regime. It's I'll have to go find sources on that. I'm taking McNair's word on it to a degree from earlier in the book. So I'll get back to you.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody in the chat for staying with us. We have 7 very, very, our app is growing leaps and bounds. We have 7 here today. There's probably including the 4 panelists, 2 Russian bots, and the CIA. So we're doing pretty good here today. We'll talk to you soon, and thanks for coming. Let's say a group bye, everybody. Bye.
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 Oh my gosh.